Welcome to Lost at 3 a.m. Put your phone down, close your eyes, and let this be the last story you hear tonight. Breathe, settle in, and let's take a quiet walk through a world that's a little darker and a little more magical. Tonight, we're stepping into the strange and beautiful imagination of Tim Burton. Before there were spirals, before the black and white stripes, before scarecrows danced on rooftops and skeletons sang in snow, there was just a kid with a pencil. Tim Burton didn't set out to become a filmmaker. He was quiet, a little withdrawn, someone who felt more at home drawing than talking. He grew up in Burbank, California, a place filled with sunshine and tidy lawns. But in the corners of his mind, he saw something else. Trees with faces, shadows that lingered longer than they should, creatures that weren't quite monsters but weren't quite human either. While most kids were playing outside, Burton was sketching. His notebooks weren't filled with superheroes or cartoons. They were filled with lonely figures, big eyes, thin limbs, things with stitches and wings, and odd little smiles. His drawings didn't look like the world around him, and maybe that was the point, because from the very beginning, Burton was building his own world, a softer, stranger place where things that didn't belong anywhere else could live. He was inspired by old horror films and stop-motion classics, Vincent Price, Ray Harryhausen, the kind of stories where the monsters were sad instead of scary, where the world was off-kilter, but still beautiful. As he got older, that sketchbook followed him into school, into art classes, eventually into CalArts, the animation program founded by Disney. It was there he learned how to make his drawings move, but even then, his style didn't quite match what Disney wanted. It was too angular, too dark, too weird, but he kept drawing. That's the thread that runs through all of Burton's work, this quiet refusal to change just to fit in. He wasn't trying to be edgy or different, he just had a specific language in his head, and no one else seemed to be speaking it. So he built it, line by line, sketch by sketch. Sad eyes, crooked trees, a certain kind of softness under all the darkness. It would take years before those drawings turned into films, before Jack Skellington, Edward Scissorhands, and Lydia Deetz stepped off the page. But the world was already forming, quietly, patiently, in the margins of notebooks no one else was reading. And in a way, it still lives there. That original spark, that quiet, slightly lonely voice saying, "You don't have to be normal to be seen. You just have to be honest." Tim Burton's first job out of college wasn't making movies. It was drawing trees, rows of them, neatly spaced, bright green, cheerful little trees that moved just right when the wind blew. He had been hired as an animator at Walt Disney Studios, an enormous opportunity for a young artist. It was everything someone in his shoes was supposed to want. A steady job, a creative space, a chance to learn from the best. But something felt off. Burton admired Disney as a kid. He loved the old stories, the motion, the charm. But when he found himself inside the machine, it didn't feel magical. It felt manufactured, and slowly the realization crept in. This place had rules, it had a look, it had a tone, and none of them matched the strange, melancholic world that lived in his head. He worked on the fox and the hound, the black cauldron and the fox and the hound again, often in the background, rarely in a role that allowed him to create anything of his own. He was good at his job, but he wasn't happy, because the thing he was best at, being different, was the very thing Disney didn't quite know what to do with. They called his sketches too grotesque, his characters too weird. There were too many shadows, too many stitches, too many sad, strange smiles. Burton wasn't trying to be rebellious. He just didn't know how to draw the world any other way. And so, quietly, he began to make things on his own. In the corners of his schedule, he created small personal projects, short films, sketches, bits of animation that no one had asked for. One of them was Vincent, a black and white stop-motion short about a boy who wanted to be Vincent Price. It was narrated by Price himself, who had become something of a personal hero to Burton over the years. The short was stark, poetic, funny in a morbid way. and hauntingly beautiful. It was also completely unlike anything else Disney was doing. The studio didn't know what to do with it. They released it quietly, barely promoted it, and moved on. Burton, meanwhile, kept working, drawing, writing, hoping maybe that someone would see what he was trying to do. Then came Frankenweenie, a 30-minute live-action short about a boy who brings his dog back to life. Burton's own take on Frankenstein, but softer, more personal. The studio liked it at first, until they didn't. Test audiences found it too dark for children, and not long after it was finished, Burton was let go. Fired from Disney for being too weird. It should have been a defeat, but in some quiet way, it was exactly the push he needed. Because outside of Disney, the rules didn't apply anymore, and the world that had been sitting quietly inside his sketchbooks finally had room to grow. Vincent and Frankenweenie weren't just side projects. They were seeds, small and strange, but alive. And all it took was someone willing to water them. By the time Tim Burton was offered his first major feature film, he'd been labelled a little too odd for the mainstream, and maybe a little too bold for the background. But then came a script, one that didn't quite make sense, one that mixed horror and comedy, the afterlife and interior design, stop motion and slapstick. It was messy, bizarre, too strange, most thought, to ever really work, and somehow that made it perfect. The film was Beetlejuice. On paper, it shouldn't have worked. A story about a dead couple haunting their own house, a bioexorcist ghost in a striped suit, a teenager who reads obituaries for fun. It didn't follow the usual story beats. The tone shifted constantly. There were sandworms, calypso music, and ghosts who filed paperwork. But Burton saw something underneath the chaos. He saw a story about loneliness, about identity, about people, living or dead, trying to figure out where they belonged. And for someone who had always felt like an outsider, it was a world that made perfect sense. What made Beetlejuice so different wasn't just its oddness, it was how unapologetically it leaned into that oddness. It didn't soften the weird, it didn't explain the rules, it just trusted the audience to follow along, or not. And somehow, they did. Burton's fingerprints are everywhere in the film. The twisted architecture, the exaggerated shadows, the characters who look like cartoons and speak like they've just woken up from a bad dream. And in the middle of it all, the Maitlands, two quiet ghosts who just want their home back, and Lydia, the teenage girl who sees the dead not as monsters, but as people. Lydia, in many ways, is the heart of the film. She's not scared of the ghosts. She's scared of being alive in a world that doesn't feel like hers. And when she finds people, even dead ones, who understand that feeling, she finally starts to feel seen. That's the quiet truth inside Beetlejuice. Beneath all the noise, the dancing skeletons, and the chaotic title character, it's a story about being invisible and finding someone who notices anyway. The film became a surprise hit. Audiences didn't just watch it, they clung to it, because it offered something most stories didn't: permission to be strange, permission to laugh at the dark, to wear black, to speak softly, to find beauty in places other stories never looked. And for Burton, it was proof that his voice, his odd, crooked, stitched-together voice, could speak to more people than he thought, not by changing, but by trusting that somewhere out there, someone was waiting for a story that looked like this. Sometimes the saddest monsters are the ones who never wanted to scare anyone. In 1990, Tim Burton released Edward Scissorhands, and for many people, fans, critics, and even Burton himself, it became more than just a film. It became a kind of modern myth, a story that looked like a fairy tale, but felt like something much closer to home. On the surface, it's strange. A man with blades for fingers, living alone in a crumbling mansion, brought into a pastel neighborhood by a kind woman who just wants to give him a chance. It sounds absurd, but from the moment Edward steps onto that perfectly trimmed lawn, the film begins whispering something softer. This isn't a story about danger. It's about difference. Burton has often said that Edward Scissorhands was the most personal story he ever told, because Edward, quiet, pale, full of wonder and fear, was him. A version of himself he'd never seen reflected in the stories he grew up with. Edward doesn't speak much. He doesn't understand the world around him, but he sees it, and more importantly, he feels it. The town is full of people who smile on the outside and ache on the inside, and for a little while, they welcome Edward. They're fascinated by him. They turn his difference into entertainment. He cuts their hedges, their hair, their dogs. He becomes a kind of local novelty, something to talk about, something to show off. But the moment he stops being convenient, they turn. Because at the heart of the story is a quiet, painful truth. People often love what makes you different, until it no longer benefits them. Then they fear it, or try to change it, or push it away. Edward falls in love, not loudly, not romantically, just gently, slowly, with someone who sees him, not for what he can do, but for who he is underneath the blades and the scars. But even that love isn't enough to save him from the world that misunderstands him. The final scenes don't end in triumph, they end in exile. Edward retreats to the mansion where the story began, carving sculptures out of ice, shaping beauty in silence. He doesn't get the girl, he doesn't fix the world, but he leaves behind a winter that never existed before him, something beautiful, falling quietly, as if to say, I was here, I mattered. That's the magic of Edward Scissorhands. It's a fairy tale where the monster is kind, the town is cruel, and the happy ending never really comes. And somehow, that makes it feel more real than most stories that promise one. It reminds us that not all love stories are about getting what you want. Sometimes, they're just about being known, even briefly, and even that can be enough. Long before Jack Skellington sang Under the Moonlight, before he rode through snowy rooftops with bones and bells and wide-eyed hope, the world of the nightmare, before Christmas lived in the margins of a poem Tim Burton wrote while working at Disney. Just a few pages, a story about a skeleton who gets tired of scaring people, stumbles into a holiday he doesn't understand, and tries to make it his own. It was simple, sad, a little eerie, and like most things Burton created, quietly full of longing. It would take years for it to become a film. Burton didn't direct it, he was busy with Batman Returns. But his fingerprints are on every frame. The spiraled hills, the crooked doorways, the stitched together smiles. He produced it, guided the design, and gave life to a story that had been sleeping in his sketchbooks since the early 80s. The film was brought to life by director Henry Selick and a team of stop-motion animators who worked painstakingly, frame by frame, moving models just a fraction of an inch at a time. Each second of footage took hours to create. Every blink, every footstep, every tiny gesture was shaped by hand, and maybe that's part of why the film feels the way it does. There's a quiet weight to stop motion, a stillness, a sense of patience you don't feel in faster films. Nothing rushes in The Nightmare Before Christmas. The world feels lived in, tired even. Halloween Town is full of monsters and ghouls, but they're not menacing. They're tired of their own routines. They want something else. Or maybe they just want to feel new again. At the heart of it all is Jack. He's not evil, not dangerous. He's just restless, caught between who he's always been and who he might become. When he discovers Christmas Town, all the warmth, the lights, the laughter, he sees possibility. But in trying to claim it, he loses sight of what made him special in the first place. It's a gentle metaphor, hidden beneath the skeletons and snow. Sometimes, when we feel lost, we try to become someone else, wear a different mask, step into someone else's season. But in the end, we can't escape what makes us who we are. And maybe we shouldn't. The music, written by Danny Elfman, carries all of that in its melodies. It's playful, melancholic, full of yearning and whimsy, often in the same breath. Elfman has said he saw himself in Jack, and when you listen to the songs, it's easy to believe. This isn't just a Halloween film or a Christmas one. It's about feeling out of place, about chasing joy when you don't understand why it keeps slipping through your fingers, and about coming home, not to where you started, but to a version of yourself you forgot was there. In the end, Jack doesn't conquer Christmas. He lets it go. And in doing so, he finds something better: clarity, connection, and the quiet return to a world that was never broken, just waiting to be seen differently. Even if you've never seen a full Tim Burton film, chances are you've seen a piece of one. Maybe it was a black and white spiral, a crooked hill curling under moonlight, a character with enormous eyes, hair like tangled string, and clothes stitched together like secrets. Burton's world doesn't look like anyone else's, and that's not by accident. His visual style was shaped early, through sketchbooks, through silent horror films, through stories where shadows didn't just follow you, they spoke. And over time, those shapes became language, not written, not spoken, but understood. At the center of it all are the contrasts: black and white, light and dark, curves and angles, the soft, glowing moon above the sharp edges of a fence, a skeleton wearing a pinstripe suit, a castle full of snow sitting just above rows of perfect pastel houses. He never fully settles into one side or the other. His worlds sit in the space between opposites. There's something oddly comforting in that. In Burton's films, symmetry is rare. Buildings lean, windows don't line up, trees stretch out in directions that make no architectural sense, but they always feel deliberate, like they're part of a dream you once had but can't quite remember. And then there are the characters, the outsiders, the misunderstood, big eyes, slouched shoulders, faces that rarely look angry, just uncertain, fragile in ways they don't know how to explain. These are not perfect people. They're too pale, too quiet, too slow to keep up with the world around them. But they have something else: curiosity, depth, a quiet kind of magic that doesn't need permission. Burton's designs invite you in, even when the world itself seems cold. He lets you linger in spaces that would normally be left in the dark: abandoned rooms, foggy graveyards, rooftops where lonely characters go just to be alone for a while. And somehow, those places become gentle. Because in Burton's world, the scary things aren't the ones with fangs or claws. The scary things are the ones that make you feel like you don't belong. And that's what makes his visual world so powerful. He draws the feeling of being an outsider, not just in his characters, but in the space around them. So when you watch his films, you're not just looking at a strange place. You're stepping into a feeling, a memory, a mood you can't quite name, but one that says, it's okay to be different here. You're not too much, you're not too little, you're just part of the picture. If you watch enough of Tim Burton's films, you start to notice the same people, the same voices, the same faces, appearing in new forms, sometimes painted in pale makeup, sometimes stitched together in shadows, but always right at home in the story. These aren't just recurring actors, they're part of the fabric. Take Johnny Depp. When Burton first cast him in Edward Scissorhands, Depp was still known mostly as a teen heartthrob, but Burton didn't want a leading man. He wanted someone who could disappear into sadness, someone who could speak with his eyes more than his voice, and Depp gave him that. What followed was one of the most unusual collaborations in modern film. 8 movies over nearly 2 decades, each one stranger than the last. From Ichabod Crane in Sleepy Hollow, to Willy Wonka, to the Mad Hatter, to Sweeney Todd, Depp became a kind of chameleon in Burton's world. Sometimes whimsical, sometimes tragic, always a little broken, always a little beautiful. Then there's Helena Bonham Carter. Intense, sharp, and endlessly layered, she became another key piece of Burton's creative universe. In Corpse Bride, Big Fish, Charlie, and The Chocolate Factory, and Sweeney Todd, she gave voice to characters who weren't just strange. They were aching, often misunderstood, often underestimated. And like so many of Burton's protagonists, she played them with a kind of elegant discomfort. And then there's Danny Elfman. not a face on screen, but a voice behind it. Burton and Elfman met just before Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and that partnership would go on to shape the sound of every Burton film that followed. Elfman's scores don't just support Burton's stories, they help define them. Playful, theatrical, and quietly aching, they swirl around the screen like part of the set. Jack Skellington's laments, Edward's gentle waltz, the sweeping strings that drift through every crooked corner. Elfman doesn't just write music, he writes mood. Together, these collaborators form a kind of emotional shorthand, a language that doesn't need explaining. When you see Johnny Depp's wide, sad eyes, or hear one of Elfman's minor chords tucked behind a carousel melody, you know you're back in Burton's world, and even if you've never been there before, it feels familiar. That's what makes this group feel less like a cast, and more like a family. A strange one, sure, but one that keeps finding its way back to the same place. Not because it's comfortable, but because there's something they're worth returning to. In most stories, love is clean, clear, neatly timed and easily resolved. The music swells, the kiss happens, and the screen fades to black. But Tim Burton doesn't tell that kind of love story. His romances tend to start somewhere quieter, on rooftops, in graveyards, behind windows, and they don't always end the way you expect, because in his world, love doesn't fix people. It simply allows them to be seen. You can feel that in Corpse Bride, a film wrapped in cobwebs and blue roses. It tells the story of Victor, a nervous groom who accidentally proposes to a dead woman and finds himself caught between the land of the living and the land of the dead. What could have been a joke, a gimmick, becomes something softer, sadder, because Emily, the corpse bride, isn't a monster. She's someone who was hurt, someone who died waiting for love to arrive and never got the ending she was promised. Victor doesn't save her. He doesn't fall madly in love and change her fate. What he does is something smaller and maybe more beautiful. He sees her, not as a curiosity, not as a mistake, just as a person who still longs for something that's already been taken. Burton's stories tend to live in that space, where longing lingers longer than it's supposed to, where people connect, not because they're perfect, but because they're both a little broken in ways that match. You can see it in Edward Scissorhands too, in the way Edward falls for Kim, not with grand declarations, but through small, wordless moments. She doesn't love him because he's different. She loves him despite the fact that the world won't allow that difference to exist comfortably, which is why they can't end up together, at least not in the usual sense. And yet, the story still feels like a kind of love. Even in Beetlejuice, with all its chaos, there's Lydia and the Maitlands, two ghosts and one lonely girl, forming a bond that doesn't need to be romantic to be real. It's love in a broader sense, a need for family, for connection, for the comfort of people who don't ask you to pretend. These stories rarely end with a wedding, or even a kiss, but they leave something behind. A hand on a shoulder, a song that's only sung once, a moment in the snow. Because in Tim Burton's world, love isn't loud. It's patient, it's imperfect, and sometimes it arrives after everything else is gone, and still, somehow, feels right on time. When Tim Burton first started telling stories, most people didn't quite know what to make of them. They were too dark to be for kids, too whimsical to be horror, too stylized to be taken seriously, but too emotional to ignore. He wasn't trying to fit into any genre, he was building his own. And for a while, that worked. In the early years, critics didn't always understand him, but audiences did. There was something about the crooked houses, the soft-spoken monsters, the colours that looked like bruises and moonlight. Something about it all that just connected, especially with people who didn't see themselves in glossy stories or happy endings. He wasn't making crowd pleasers in the traditional sense, but his work built a crowd anyway, one that still follows him, even now. Over time, that following grew into something bigger. Burton became a household name. His style became recognizable, imitated, sometimes exaggerated. You could see it in music videos, Halloween costumes, art styles, even in other films that had nothing to do with him at all. There's something strange about being known for being strange. Eventually, Burton's name itself became a kind of brand. A Tim Burton film didn't just tell you who made it, it told you what it would feel like. Curled trees, pale faces, music with bells in the background. But with that came something else, expectation. And as his career moved forward, the reaction to his work started to shift. Some critics said he'd become a little too comfortable in his own world, that the weirdness had turned into a formula, that the stories weren't evolving, that the sharp, aching sadness of Edward Scissorhands had softened into something more theatrical, less intimate. Maybe there's some truth to that, maybe not. But what's clear is this: even after decades of storytelling, Burton has never really tried to blend in. His work is still full of ghosts, still full of love stories that don't quite work out, still full of creatures who are either too big for the world or too soft for it. And while not every film lands the same way, that thread has never disappeared. Because Burton isn't chasing approval. He's drawing the same things he always has. The same kinds of eyes, the same lonely places, the same feeling of not quite belonging, and making peace with that. Somewhere along the way, that became its own kind of legacy. Not a perfect one, not a straight line of success, but a long, winding trail of stories. Ones that mean the most to people who never saw themselves in fairy tales, until Burton built some new ones. There's something comforting about a Tim Burton story. Not because the endings are always happy, not because the worlds are easy to understand, but because somewhere inside the shadows and the spirals and the sad-eyed characters, there's always a message, quiet, steady, and gently repeated. You don't need to change to be loved. You don't need to smile all the time. You don't have to be brave or graceful or normal. You can be stitched together. You can be awkward. You can live in a crooked house and talk to ghosts and wear black in summer. And even then, even like that, you can still find connection. That's what his films have always offered. Not just escape, but recognition. Because whether it's Jack Skellington trying to be something he's not, or Edward Scissorhands reaching out with hands he can't control, or Lydia Dietz quietly saying she's strange and unusual, Burton gives space to the people who don't usually get the spotlight. And it matters. It matters to the kids who grew up feeling a little out of place, to the teens who were too quiet or too intense, or just didn't know where to sit at lunch, to the adults who still carry that with them, tucked under the surface. Burton's world gives them permission to stay soft, to feel deeply, to make art that doesn't always make sense. Not every story has to be perfect. Sometimes it just has to feel true. And maybe that's the lasting beauty of Tim Burton's movie world. It doesn't promise answers. It just offers a hand, a little off-center, a little awkward, and says, you can stay here if you want. So if you ever feel like you're a little too much, or not quite enough, remember the worlds he built, with their bent fences and stitched smiles, their skeletons and their music, their lonely heroes, and the strange little towns that always feel like home. Because there's a place for you there, and it's been waiting. Thank you for spending your night with Lost at 3 a.m. Sleep well, and good night.